Okay, so thank you very much for coming to our, oh, there's more people coming in, to our November Evergreen Forum. I want to thank Evergreen Health for sponsoring this for us. And we are very, very, very pleased to have Susie Kroll here with us tonight. And apparently many people are very interested in hearing what she has to say. She's one of my favorite people. She's my go-to gal. And she works with the police department in Redmond. She'll tell you a little bit more about it, but she earned her Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology from City University of Seattle. And she's the alum of the University of Washington. She had a Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communication, a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology,
I know, right?
with a marine emphasis in 2001. But something changed, and she became a clinician with a community mental health agency upon her graduation with a counseling psychology degree. So while employed with this agency, she promoted to clinic manager, regional operations director, division director, overseeing the day-to-day operations of 6 outpatient mental health, primary care, and substance abuse recovery centers. She gained her assessment and crisis experience by working in King County emergency departments, providing psychological assessments, making treatment recommendations, working with the Involuntary Treatment Act Court, and starting co-responder models in 6 police departments in King and Snohomish County, which is, I think, what you are really known for is your co-responding. She's a national speaker and an educator on crisis response, mental health, de-escalation, and with the Elite Speakers Bureau. She also, which I think is very important, instructs at the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission for CIT, which is the police academy, and is also an adjunct professor at City University, a mental health advisor for crisis systems management, but she also loves golden retrievers and she has 2 rescue kittens, which is very important too.
That's probably the most important thing.
It's the most important.
The critters.
She loves pets, but she also, that's why she's so good at what she does, right? But right now she works for the Redmond Police Department and she's their community support administrator and co-responding mental health professional. And oh, one more thing. She's trained as a crisis and hostage negotiator, mental health professional with the King County Sheriff's Office Crisis Negotiation Team. It is not so often that we have such a long list of things that somebody has, but I'll tell you what, Susie is very versed on the subject that we're talking about tonight. So, Susie, I will turn it over to you to discuss our subject tonight.
Thank you, Barbara. You're so sweet. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk with folks. I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of apprehension and quite a bit of just really what does this look like? And unfortunately, most people find out about these things after they're in the middle of a crisis. And that could be for the person that's experiencing it, or it may also end up being friends or family members of folks experiencing a crisis. And that's unfortunately when folks have to figure out what this whole system means. So with that being said, I am very, very conversational. If you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me. I will have time at the tail end of this for Q&A. If there's a question that you don't want to forget, you can pop it in the chat. I'm going to passively watch that so that I make sure I go through them at the end. And then I'm basically not going to kill you with a PowerPoint presentation because as a professional speaker, I find that tragic. And nobody's trying to cause any more crises for anybody by death by PowerPoint. So instead, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be sharing a screen with you that is an infographic that talks a lot about what we are going to be discussing today. And the prompt for why I'm here is that there is an extreme emphasis now put on crisis response, not just locally or within King County, but nationwide. And there is a pretty big movement toward trying to figure out what the best crisis response should look like and what's the most helpful. But what I'm finding, regardless of the pressure on that, is to determine what the crisis response actually is. And I find that most of the calls that I attend to when I'm going out with my partners, with my police officer partners, questions about the ITA or the Involuntary Treatment Act system. And we can kind of start that off with the idea that we all have a preconceived notion of what involuntary treatment looks like. It may be from a handful of episodes of Law and Order. It may be from a coworker, a friend, or a family member's experience. It may be from somebody's college courses. It may be from pure imagination and conjecture because we've never really been involved in these systems if you don't have firsthand experience, or it may just be with the barrage of media and social media attention that crisis is getting of late. So you may be basing some sort of idea about how crisis response looks based upon the snippets of information that are provided from a myriad of locations. But I've found in my role that that level of snippet tends to be more problematic than helpful, in that most of the entities that are involved in our crisis response only know their little teeny slice of the pie, and they know it extremely well, but they don't know what happens after referrals. They don't know what happens after the police show up. They don't know what happens with court. So Barbie and I talked at length about how we can help muddle through the incredible number of legislative changes that have, mostly from my perspective, caused some negative unintended consequences to crisis response by level setting what crisis response in King County and frankly Washington State actually looks like, so that when you are encountering a crisis, when it's someone that you love and care about in a crisis, and when you're seeking referrals for how to best manage a circumstance, you're not basing it on snippets of information or things that we've heard that may or may not be accurate. So I'm going to be sharing a screen with you that is an infographic for what this looks like. If I can get it to pull up on my screen properly. Can you see the process on the police? Negative?
No, now we just see your swimming
Well,
thing.
that's not helpful, is
But
it?
it's, I don't know, it looks, it's nice.
How about now? Is that better?
Okay. Yes, better.
Okay.
Now we see it.
So you're gonna get me goofy looking to the side, but that's okay because nobody really needs to see my face anyway.
We do.
All right, so we're going to talk about the Involuntary Treatment Act, and that is what the state has in place for getting people into a psych hold. We've probably all heard somebody say, oh, a 72-hour psych hold, or a psychiatric hold, or an involuntary treatment hold. In Washington State, what that means is that there is a person that is demonstrating a certain set of criteria that is needing to be put, whether they want to or not, on a psychiatric hold in order to get help. And I say help loosely because when we go through this a little bit more, you'll see kind of what that means. In California, it is 72 hours long, and there are dozens of folks that can place somebody on a psychiatric hold. Somebody with my specific credentialings, a doctor, a nurse, crisis responders that go out with police, they can all put somebody on that 72-hour psychiatric hold. In Washington State, that's not possible. In Washington State, there is an entity called the Designated Crisis Responders. So DCR, Designated Crisis Responders. And they are the only people in this state that are allowed to take somebody and put them on an involuntary psychiatric hold. Our holds in Washington State are now 120 hours long, not 72. And they don't count weekends or holidays. So if somebody is placed on a psychiatric hold by a designated crisis responder on a Friday, that 5-day or 120-hour countdown won't start until Monday. So know that if somebody is placed on an involuntary hold for psychiatric care because they meet the handful of criteria that we're going to talk about, their time clock doesn't start unless it's a day of the week, not a holiday, not a weekend. And if it occurs over the weekend, then the time is suspended and resumes when that next working day starts. So it's feasible to have a 120-hour hold, but it's also feasible to have that initial hold be longer if, say, it occurs over the Thanksgiving holiday or if it started on a Friday afternoon. All that to say, this infographic is going to talk a lot about what this looks like. And there are going to be pieces in here where we discuss some of the legislative changes that have impacted law enforcement's, mental health professionals' ability to get people the care that they need. At its most basic function, the designated crisis responders are a group of people that work for public health. In King County, they work for a division of public health called Crisis and Commitment Services. Their education is similar to mine, where you have to have a master's degree or higher in counseling psychology, social work, marriage and family therapy, or a related field to show that you have the diagnostic capabilities to recognize behaviors and do assessments. And then those designated crisis responders are responsible for filling out legal court documents that determine whether or not somebody is detained on that 120-hour hold. There are 3 ways that a designated crisis responder will go out to see someone and assess as to whether or not they meet criteria for that 120-hour hold. One of the ways is by going out to a local emergency room once somebody has either self-admitted or the police have brought somebody in on what they call an invol or an involuntary transport, because the police have determined some of those criteria that we're going to talk about are being met. So DCRs can go to a hospital and they'll see somebody in the ER. DCRs will also go out to see people in the community if friends or family or mental health professionals, counselors, or anyone has made a referral to see somebody out in their home, or if they're in an encampment, or if they have an area that they frequent because they're not in a transitional housing setting or they don't have any other place to stay. So they'll do a community assessment if they can locate that person. The third way that designated crisis responders see folks is if they are in jail and they are able to go out and see people and assess for whether or not they need that 120-hour psychiatric hold and intervention. If they're in a jail and they're charged with a misdemeanor or less charge, they typically don't go out to see folks that are being charged with felonies, because if it's determined that they need that psychiatric hold, then they typically are not able to go to your local inpatient behavioral health agency, because felonies usually denote a level of violence or instability that that hospital isn't able to manage. All that to say, I've had some folks that have gone in on felony charges be assessed in jail by the DCRs, but they treat that in a case-by-case basis. So designated crisis responders go out to the community to see people, they go out to the emergency rooms to see people, and they go potentially out to the jails to assess people to determine if they meet criteria to be held psychiatrically for that 120-hour hold. All of these calls start with some sort of issue with someone being in crisis. And when it comes to law enforcement and our interactions, a lot of this discussion is going to be the role that police play, or the role that police and their co-responding mental health professional plays. And you'll see that this will make a little bit more sense as we go through this. All that to say, we start out with a person in crisis, and this may be, as I say, routine, not in a dismissive way, but as frequent a call that I go to for a welfare check. Say that somebody says, Joe Friendly's texting me, he's saying that he's super depressed, doesn't want to live anymore, wants to kill himself, and has a way to do it. They call 911, our dispatchers let us know that a welfare check is being asked for with some of that information. And then my partners and I go out to see how that person's doing. That's technically a person in crisis. If police are going out, we do basically a little bit of a safety assessment. If somebody says that they have firearms and they're wanting to commit suicide by the use of a firearm, or we have a past history of violence other than related to that mental health issue, then that determines if it's just my partner and I, or if it's my partner and I and another police officer, or if it's my partner and I and the fire department, depending on if there's a medical concern as well, or if the attempt is currently active. So we actually triage very in depth who goes out for what. And if at all possible, I can speak very clearly for Redmond on this, if it's a family or a person or an address that we have knowledge or history of, or there's an officer on duty that knows the person, then we would likely be trying to send that officer and myself to go out, so that there is some case familiarity and some hopefully rapport being built previous to this initial call. But if we have a person in crisis and we suspect a behavioral health issue, and when I say behavioral health, I mean both substance abuse and or mental health concerns are at play, mixing in with that level of crisis, then we try to make sure that the officers are going out, if I'm on duty, that I'm going with them. There are a handful of criteria that are available to determine whether or not somebody meets criteria. Either one, for the police to say, hey, Joe Friendly, I know you don't want to go, but we're going to make you go to the hospital even if you don't want to. or for the DCRs to say, yep, sorry, Joe Friendly, you meet this criteria or this criteria. We're going to have you held involuntarily for the 120 hours, whether you want to or not. There is a piece of this legislation for designated crisis responders and psychiatric holds that mandates that there be imminency. And the definition of imminent is the state or condition of being likely to occur at any moment or near at hand, rather than in the distant future, distant or remote, which if anybody is not an attorney or just reads that, it's like, I'm sorry, what? That's about as clear as mud. We can figure out what imminency means. We can kind of subjectively and objectively look at that, but that is the definition of imminence for the state of Washington, the state or condition of being likely to occur at any moment or near at hand, rather than distant or remote. So police officers are making the determination as to whether or not Joe Friendly is meeting criteria with that caveat of imminence. So if Joe Friendly says, yes, I'm very depressed, I'm suicidal, I'm going to kill myself on June 30th, 2026, there's no imminency there. There are some fail safes so that, Joe Friendly would get a referral to me or to someone else to check up on him through something we'll talk about a little bit later, but there's no imminence there. Now, if Joe Friendly says, yes, I'm going to kill myself in 20 minutes, that changes a little bit of the circumstance. But I want you to have an overall framework for what this looks like. So the criteria for somebody to meet potential transport by the police to the hospital against their will, or for the DCRs to look at them and say, hey, you might meet criteria to be held involuntarily, are this: suicidality, homicidality, grave disability, or property damage to someone else's property other than their own. So if I'm upset, homicidal, suicidal, and I smash the heck out of everything in my house and there's nothing else there, I can't be taken to the hospital. Now, if I'm feeling depressed and upset and I go to my neighbor's house and smash everything in it, then that's damage to somebody else's property. And there is no dollar amount specified. So long as it's not mine, that can check that box for property damage. Know that when we're talking about this, that there can be a different type of response that law enforcement may have versus a designated crisis responder, because the designated crisis responders are looking to see whether or not a legal statute is being met. So what we see oftentimes is a DCR and a cop and an MHP going, yep, absolutely, Joe Friendly is sick. He needs help. He needs some sort of intervention, but he's not meeting imminency. So we can't take him. The DCRs don't detain him, and he's kind of just stuck there unless he's willing to engage in other services. So what's really hard for a lot of the family members that I talk to is that clearly we see, as plain as the nose on my face, somebody's really sick. Somebody needs to see a counselor, needs to get in for a psychiatric evaluation, possibly needs medication management, possibly needs some sort of inpatient stabilization, but they still may not be the sickest of the sick that the designated crisis responders would detain, which is heartbreaking for a lot of families, because we're tasked with basically then saying you need to get a little bit worse before you can get better. And I can give you an example here toward the end of this, what I mean by that. For suicidality, and that's one of the criteria that somebody can meet, it can be one or more of these criteria, they just have to hit one, is somebody is a danger to themselves due to deliberate threats or attempts to commit suicide. So Joe Friendly could say he's suicidal, has tried in the past in recent history, or is going to try again and has a plan and a means and a method. Somebody that wants to kill themselves is meeting that criteria for suicidality. Now, remember, we still need to have imminence. Homicidality is the other way that somebody can meet one of these benchmarks for involuntary treatment. And that's threats or attempts to harm other people or identified targets or locations. So I could say, Joe Friendly tells me that he's going to go to 12345 Main Street and talk to Bob. And since he's mad at Bob, he's going to hurt Bob. That would be an identified targeted person. Or Joe Friendly could say, I'm really upset. I don't like any of this. I'm going to go to Fred Meyer on XYZ Street at 4:00 and I'm just going to start killing people. That's an identified location and target, and that would count for criteria for homicidality. If there's a plan, if there's a means, method, identified target. Grave disability has got two parts to it, and the person has to meet one or both. And this tends to get a little muddy for law enforcement, and it gets confusing for just your average community member also. And then I will give you an example of why this is confusing. So grave disability A states that that is the condition in which a person, as a result of a mental health or substance abuse issue, is in danger of serious physical harm resulting from the failure to provide for their own essential human needs or safety. So this is somebody who is not eating, not sleeping for days on end, not maintaining their hygiene, not taking medications that they're supposed to take for blood pressure or diabetes or a health issue that shows that if these things aren't taken care of, there is an imminent potential risk for injury or death. So if Joe Friendly is not showering, hasn't slept in 3 days, is not eating, has lost 10 pounds in a week, and is not taking his high blood pressure medication, then he may meet criteria for grave disability A because he's failing to act in his own best interest to care for himself. Grave disability B is the other part of this, which means that it manifests as a severe deterioration in routine functioning, as evidenced by repeated and escalating loss of cognitive or volitional control over their actions and is not receiving essential care needed for their health and safety. So if I go out to see Joe Friendly, for him to meet grave disability B, it would be like me going and saying, hey, Joe Friendly, I'm Suki. I'm the mental health professional from the Redmond Police Department. Tell me what's going on. Some people are concerned about you. And Joe Friendly looks at me and says, blue shines the acetaminophen for alcohol with the clip. Hey, Joe, can you tell me the last time you had some food? Yoshi runs talcum powder to slobber. That would be a loss of volitional control. If I'm not able to have a fair conversation, even if that conversation is filled with delusions, then I'm seeing a loss of cognition or loss of volitional control. So I could see somebody that says, the NSA is after me. They're shooting lasers into my house. I know that they're going to kill me if I don't do all of these things. And I know that they're after me because I see the dots on the wall and I see the smoke down windows of the cars that drive by. That doesn't demonstrate a loss of volitional control. That may demonstrate some grave disability if he is unable to feed himself, sleep, eat, take care of those pieces. But you'll hear a lot of designated crisis responders and police officers and fire EMS folks say in the state of Washington, it's not illegal to have a mental health issue. It's not illegal to have, impacts of delusions or hallucinations. So there isn't just going to be the automatic, hey, Joe Friendly, you think the NSA is after you with lasers and you're being electrocuted through your pores from concrete benches. That isn't grounds to get somebody involuntarily transported, let alone held, which is frustrating for families because clearly that isn't a healthy standpoint to have, but that doesn't meet the imminency piece of this. So that volitional control has to lead to that person not being able to take care of themselves. So if Joe Friendly has the conspiracy theories and the delusions and the hallucinations, but he's eating breakfast and taking a shower, it's a little bit harder of a run to try and express to a designated crisis responder that there needs to be something that happens involuntarily.
Susie, can I ask you a question just around these grave disabilities that somebody in our chat has asked? If there's somebody who is paranoid and exhibiting some of these things, but they're living by themselves and they won't answer the door, they're probably not eating. How do you get them help?
So it's funny that you bring that up, Barbie. That was the last call I was on about a half an hour ago. I have an individual who has been barricaded in their residence, refusing to come out, very paranoid of being surveilled. I have reports from a family member that they've lost about 60 pounds, which is a significant amount of weight in a very short amount of time. It was as of September. We went last week to conduct a welfare check and knocked on the doors and called out to the windows, and we didn't hear any sounds of distress. We didn't hear anybody calling for help. We didn't hear any noise, TV, running water, nothing. We also didn't have, suffice it to say, it's kind of gross, but didn't have any funky smells, even though we had family members saying nobody'd seen him for several weeks. So we had absolutely no reason to open the door or force our way in. I know that there's a significant mental health issue going on there. I know the history of the individual. I know the circumstances and the things that we're concerned about. But because that person has a reasonable expectation of privacy, and there was no indicator of an imminent threat or somebody calling out in distress, we had to drive away. It took another week for family to come up and actually break in, which we tried to coach not to have happen, but I can't control what friends or family do. And we did find him. He's alive, nothing wrong per se, but clearly decompensated enough that he needed intervention. But when I get down to the lower part of this infographic, we couldn't take him to the hospital per the new 1310 laws. He was unresponsive, catatonic, not answering questions. He had lost a significant amount of weight, but family members had actually helped clean up the house and get him bathed. And so when we asked him, would you like to go to the hospital? And he didn't respond, and he's not actively in an attempt of suicide. He's not actively homicidal. He's showing evidence of having some food, not a ton, he's lost some weight, but there's food in the house and he's got somebody watching over him. Technically, we would have had to have driven away from that. But the person had a warrant for another issue, so we were able to take him into custody on the warrant and then elect to transport him to a hospital instead of a jail. We ran into the wrinkle that the jail wouldn't take him anyway because he hadn't been medically cleared, given the concerns for the weight loss. So he went to the hospital, and I'm currently kind of managing that right now. So you can see the frustration, and I'll get to why that kind of worked out that way here in a second. But I kind of covered it ahead of time when I talked about the designated crisis responders. They are the only people in this state that can issue a 120-hour hold. No doctor, no dentist, no counselor, no mental health professional, because I am not a DCR. That is not my role, so I cannot detain anybody regardless of what I see. No counselor, no nurse, no emergency technician, no firefighter. Nobody can force somebody into a 120-hour psychiatric hold except a DCR. When police take somebody to the emergency room, we are not putting them on a 120-hour hold. We are actually transporting them to an emergency room to have an emergency room social worker review our paperwork and assess that person when they see them to see if they see what I and my partner saw, one or more of these criteria: grave disability, homicidality, suicidality, property damage. And if they agree, then they will call the designated crisis responders, and the designated crisis responders will go to that emergency room and then do a whole nother assessment to see if they see what my partner and I saw, what the ER social worker saw, and whether or not that patient now will agree to a less restrictive option like outpatient therapy, or if they already have a counselor that they're going to re-engage with, or if they'll take an appointment to see somebody the next day. And if that patient agrees to see somebody outside of the ER, they won't get that 120-hour hold. Barbie, what's your question?
This is a chat question, which is, do you know how many DCRs we have in the state?
In the state?
In the
Well,
state? Do you know how many, like, locally?
I can give you some good perspective on that. So I was a DCR for a very, 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 very minuscule short amount of time. It ended up being a conflict of interest in my work with law enforcement, so I couldn't continue to do that. But for full transparency, I was a DCR for about 2.5 months until we realized there was a conflict there. King County has, I believe, the last known number of DCRs was 52 for the entire state of, for the entirety of King County. They work 24/7. They have 5 shifts a day, And on each shift, 5 DCRs work, and they go out to emergency rooms or they go out into the community. And then one person that's a DCR stays to get the referrals from the community or MHPs or whatever. So they usually can see 4 or 5 people in that 9.5-hour shift, because 2 DCRs go out in a pair when they see somebody in the community for safety. If they're going to an emergency room, then it's usually one person going to the local emergency rooms. So they are pretty backlogged with trying to get out to see folks. When I first started doing mental health work, DCRs wait times, the queue that I would see as a counselor was that they would get out into the community within about 72 hours to see somebody. DCRs now, pre-ish, post-ish, middle of a pandemic, plus the change in legislation, have them triaging the severity of the referrals that come in and determining how they get out there. I've had some get out there as quick as 3 or 4 or 5 days. And then I've had others that have taken longer and some that have taken shorter. So really they're doing a lot of triage work to try and figure out who is having the hardest time and who they need to get out to. I'll also tell you that if the DCRs went out to see Joe Friendly and he was in his apartment and they said, hey, King County Crisis and Commitment Designated Crisis Responders, Joe Friendly, can we talk to you? And Joe Friendly said, heck no, beat feet, I don't want to deal with you. The DCRs would have to leave. They can't force entry either. So there has to be a little bit of willing participation. Adrienne, do you have a question?
Yes, I was just going to make a comment that I'm a therapist and I recently made a DCR call and it took them a month and a day to see my client.
Yeah, it's a pretty steep backlog.
And she was acutely suicidal when I called.
Mm.
And I escalated it several times, de-escalated it once and re-escalated it again. And it took a month and a day.
I feel your pain. They are averaging about a month. I've had a couple go a little faster, like a week. But it's been even a captive audience for the folks that I've had assessed in the jails. It's been a little tough. So no, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to make sure that I at least give you the bare bones basics. But yes, I appreciate that because it's not just me seeing those really, really lengthy delays. Now I will tell you that Snohomish County, Thurston County, Pierce County, their DCRs operate differently. King County will not let DCRs ride with police, hence the conflict. But Snohomish County DCRs, Skagit County DCRs, Pierce County DCRs, they ride with police and they can detain on site in the street, which gets people to the hospitals faster. I am personally and professionally unclear as to why the DCRs in King County can't co-respond with law enforcement, but that's just the way the circumstances land right now. So yes, DCRs are the only ones that can do those 120-hour detentions. They see them in the ERs, they see people in the community, and it's called a NED, a non-emergent detention, or they see folks in the jails if there's a non-felony. Here are things to think about. Substantial risk are some of the things that I put into paperwork. So physical harm that will be inflicted by a person upon their own person, as evidenced by threats or attempts to commit suicide or inflict harm on themselves. Physical harm will be inflicted by a person upon another, as evidenced by behavior which has caused harm or which places another person in reasonable fear of sustaining harm. That's that homicidality clause. Or physical harm that will be inflicted by a person upon the property of others, as evidenced by causing substantial loss or damage to the property of others. Again, there's no dollar amount set, but that's how you kind of glean out the homicidality, suicidality, grave disability. There are 3 caveats that roll with the Involuntary Treatment Act. They're Ricky's Law, Sheena's Law, and Joel's Law. Sheena's Law is a way for folks to not fall through the cracks. So if we go out to see Joe Friendly, me and my partners, and he says, yeah, I've had major depressive disorder for 20 years. I feel suicidal all the time, but I've never acted on it, or I don't want to kill myself. I just feel terrible and think about suicide a lot. He's not going to meet criteria in any way, shape, or form for an involuntary transport, let alone an involuntary 120-hour hold. But he does meet criteria for Sheena's Law, which is a referral that we make to the crisis connections folks to have somebody follow up with him within 24-ish. It's busy right now. It's usually taken about 48, 72 at this point hours to see if he'd be willing to engage in services. So Sheena's Law is the referrals that law enforcement make for somebody who expresses suicidality with no imminence. Ricky's Law is what changed the ability for DCRs to kind of look at a circumstance and say, you know what, your homicidality, suicidality, grave disability, or property damage isn't just due to a mental health issue. Up until several years ago, the only way you could be detained on one of these holds is if your homicidality, suicidality, grave disability, or property damage was due to an underlying mental health concern. Now, with Ricky's Law, what that has done is it's also said that if your homicidality, suicidality, grave disability, or property damage is due to substance abuse, then you can be held for that 120 hours. So if I had Joe Friendly in front of me and he said he just did a ton of heroin and it's going to make him go hurt people at the Fred Meyer. But otherwise, when he's sober, he has no mental health issues, which is atypical, but for the example I'm using, then he could be held for that 120 hours. There is one facility right now that can do those holds. It's Recovery Place in Kent for Valley Cities, and they are able to hold somebody psychiatrically if their criteria for this hold is met due to substance abuse, not just mental health issues. So Ricky's Law encompassed some of that substance abuse issue. Joel's Law came about when you have a friend or a family member that's gone through an assessment by the designated crisis responders and they go, yeah, no, Joe Friendly doesn't meet criteria, so sorry. He's not getting detained here at this moment. If the friends or family members, usually family, disagree, then they have within 2 weeks of the denial by the DCRs to hold that person to submit an application to appeal that no. So Joel's Law is an entire application that you can submit in the state of Washington that says, I know the DCR said no, here's all this extra information they should consider. Hey, judge, will you overturn this decision by the DCRs to not detain? You can't use Joel's Law until a DCR has given you a decision that they're not detaining, and you can only use Joel's Law within 2 weeks of that denial. Otherwise, you get to start this whole process over again. And what that usually constitutes is a phone call to Crisis Connections or to the public line for the designated crisis responders. I will tell you that it's an answering service when you call the DCRs, and they will ask you for your first and last name and a phone number and the first and last name and date of birth of the person you're calling for. They will put you into a queue and a DCR will call you back. If you miss that DCR's call, you can't call the DCRs back directly. You have to call that line you did the first time and get put back in the queue to have a DCR call you back. And then at that point, when you are speaking to a DCR and not the answering service, that's when you can give all of the information you possibly can to make the referral for the DCRs to see that person. And that person usually is at that point needing to be assessed in a community. But if you open a case for them to be seen in the community and somehow they're able to get to the hospital, you can call that number again, get in the queue and tell them that that person is in the hospital, and the DCRs will then try to get out to the hospital to see them if the social worker calls to invite them. So there's another caveat. If Joe Friendly goes to the ER because he needed to, and you had already put in a DCR referral, and you call them and go, hey, Joe Friendly's in the ER, they'll say, okay, thank you for letting me know. We can see about going out, but we can't go out unless the emergency room social worker agrees that the person needs an assessment. So I make the kind of funny analogy that DCRs are like vampires when it comes to hospitals. They can't enter a hospital for an assessment unless they're invited in by a social worker. So even if I made the initial DCR referral for Joe Friendly, and now he's managed to get to an ER, unless the social worker there goes, oh yeah, we totally agree, Joe Friendly needs to be seen. Hey, DCRs, can you come? The DCRs just can't show up in an ER to do an assessment. Now, mind you, usually there's a pretty good overlap and there's good communication there. And they'll say, yeah, we already have an open case. Should we come and assess them? And then the social worker will go, yeah, that's probably a good idea. But know that you can't refer a DCR to a hospital. They have to be invited in by the emergency room social workers, which is infinitely frustrating. Caveats to this. So pre-July 25th of this year, if we went out to see Joe Friendly and he was suicidal and he met imminency, but said, heck no, I'm not going, law enforcement could actually put their hands on somebody and help them to a gurney. Even if the person was kind of pushy, fighty, they would still help that person get to a gurney, help get the ambulance company to transport them, or help fire or EMS get that person into an ambulance to go to the hospital. 1310 says now law enforcement cannot put their hands on anyone in a mental health crisis, whether it's substance abuse or mental health issues, if there is not imminency. And it goes back to that little piece up there that I was talking about not in the distant future. It has to be near at hand or going to happen very quickly. So if Joe Friendly said, I'm going to go to the Fred Meyer at 9 o'clock tonight, and I'm going to do these things, we are waiting for language to come from the legislation to clear up what that imminency actually looks like. Some departments will say, well, you got a time frame, so yeah, we got to prevent that. Other departments will say, nope, it's too far away. It's not imminently happening right in this moment. We're not putting our hands on this person. We've seen it go a couple different ways depending on the department's response for how their legal advisors are interpreting the legislation for House Bill 1310. Some folks are not even going to mental health and welfare checks anymore, depending on the department. Others are, but have a long threshold before they'll put their hands on somebody to try and force them to go to a hospital. To the degree that if we're out in the community and the DCRs call and say, hey, we're here with Joe Friendly, we see he meets criteria to go to the hospital, can you come and assist us with getting him there? If we get there and Joe Friendly goes, not going, I don't care if there's a DCR court order, the police cannot put their hands on Joe Friendly to get him on the gurney, even with a DCR's order. He would have to be actively hurting himself in that moment, or actively walking toward the Fred Meyer or whatever it is to meet that imminency piece. And it's still a very blurry continuum for what legal advisors for police departments are determining as far as imminency and whether or not somebody can put their hands on someone. I will tell you that the consequences for putting their hands on someone post 1310 is severe if it's prosecuted. It won't just be that somebody gets a complaint in their file. If we violate 1310 in any way, there is the process of getting fired from your police department and being decertified so that you can be a law enforcement officer nowhere. So this is life-altering, retirement-killing, livelihood-destroying things that officers and deputies are faced with, where we clearly see somebody needs some help, but 1310 says, don't you put your hands on that person. They have to basically be voluntary, involuntary. Like, hey, Joe Friendly, we've got a court order here. These folks are saying you need the help. This might be your opportunity to really figure out, what would be the most helpful, or at least plead your case to the social workers and show that you're not really what they think they're seeing with you. Do you think you just get on the gurney and go to the hospital to get checked out? If he says, go away, pound sand, we have to walk away. But we're testing our best negotiation skills to try and get folks to reasonably and compliantly go along with involuntary treatment. Now, the other piece of this is that those non-emergent detentions are getting entered into a system called NCIC or WASIC, and they're being listed as a mental health do not arrest, but get to the hospital warrant. So it's not like a criminal warrant where you're in trouble for something like that. It's a way that police officers are getting notified that if they come across Joe Friendly and he has a non-emergent detention that the DCRs have said he needs treatment for, then if we can reasonably, with some compliance and willingness, get him to go to the hospital, then we can try to get him there. Again, no hands-on, no force, no you're going whether you like it or not, nothing like that. But that's one of the ways that we're getting notified when the DCRs do a community assessment and the person meets criteria to be detained for that 120 hours. We're getting a warrant hit. That's just how they had to label it. But it's civil, so there's no criminality associated with it. It's just a way that our system tells us somebody needs to go to the hospital, and we do our level best to negotiate and try and get them to go. But we can't force them. And then if we can't force them, we call the supervisor on the DCR's schedule for that day, and we go, hey, we saw Joe Friendly, he said no, we tried. Or hey, we're here with Joe Friendly, he said he's willing to go, he'll be at Overlake. And we notify the DCRs that way. Here is the biggest piece of information for this entire process that I think you should know about. This ITA process is not designed to get anybody healthy. It is not designed to get anybody well. This entire Involuntary Treatment Act process is designed to stabilize somebody so they are no longer homicidal, suicidal, gravely disabled, or destroying property. When they can get that level of stabilization away from one or more of those criteria, then that person is released from the hospital with the possibility that they can engage in outpatient treatment to then get better. And they will only be released from that 120-hour hold after court dates and a whole nother process if they become stabilized and are no longer homicidal, suicidal, gravely disabled, or damaging property. So somebody can not be suicidal, but still have tons of delusions and hallucinations that are problematic, but they will likely be released from that 120-hour hold to attend outpatient treatment in order to then get stabilizing true recovery help. But this system is not going to fix that. This is just taking away the imminent danger. Does that make sense?
Yes.
As far as frustrating goes, hopefully it makes sense. What are your questions? And I'll pull up.
I can read you some of the questions, Susie. And
Perfect.
first of all, thank you for doing this work. I mean, I know it's not the easiest job in the world, to say the very least, but you do it well. That's why you are my Wonder Woman. But thank you for doing the work. Someone asked, is there a way to get help if they don't meet those contingencies, but they're very ill? Like, what do you recommend?
So I would recommend reaching out to your local counseling agencies and try to build enough rapport up that the folks that, well, there's a bunch of different ways, right? You can make referrals to the DCRs and see if they can go out and kind of build a paper trail that way. You can reach out to your local mental health professional with the police department. And if there's history, then it can be kind of the squeaky wheel that I pay attention to until somebody gets to that level. I also spend a great deal of time talking with folks about how they're feeling before it gets this way and try to make it so that they can be seen in an outpatient setting. Like, hey man, if I can't get enough rapport with somebody who's actively maybe having delusions or hallucinations, I may say, man, what is the most stressful thing that's going on for you? Do you want some help with that? Do you want help with the stress management, paying the bills or case management or anything like that? So I look for another avenue to get somebody in front of a professional and work that way, because then I'm trusting that the folks that I'm referring to case management will see some of the other symptomology. But as far as like, here's a crisis, here's the imminency, there's no way to push it other than trying to see if there are other avenues in that person's life that could benefit from some sort of intervention. So I may know somebody's full-on problem is that they have maybe symptomology for undiagnosed schizophrenia and they definitely need some med stabilization. But if their biggest problem is they can't leave their house to get groceries because they're so scared of, all of the stimuli, then I'm going to solve the grocery issue. And then if I can earn that level of trust from the grocery issue, then maybe the next thing I bring up will be something that person will be amenable to working on. So there's no real tidy way unless they're really voluntarily wanting to engage in something. And that's usually the technique that I use to find that engagement.
Just a couple quick answer questions, and then Adrienne has her hand up. Can you clarify a non-emergent detention NED?
Non-emergent detention is the piece that I was talking about related to a designated crisis responder going out and assessing somebody in the community. So if I called and said, hey, I'm Susie Kroll, I'm the MHP from Redmond PD. I am wanting to call in a referral for Joe Friendly. He's doing this. And then at a later date, the DCRs go out and see him because he's currently not imminently suicidal or homicidal, but I see kind of where the train's going down the tracks. Then they will go out to assess him and do something called a non-emergent detention, where they'll either fill out paperwork in the field to have him detained, or they'll go back to their office, fill out the paperwork and put it in front of a judge. And then that's when that order goes into our NCIC WASIC system and says, hey, whenever you come across Joe Friendly, there's an order to get him to the hospital. Please try to get him there. So the non-emergent detention typically occurs out in the community versus an emergent detention is when a DCR sees somebody in an emergency room.
Okay. Just based on that too, is it the same for juveniles?
There's a can of worms.
I'm
So
sorry, make it quick. Yeah, we only have a little bit
DCRs
of
do
time.
not do detentions on juveniles.
Okay,
They will sometimes talk to folks that are 17-ish, depending, but kiddos that need this level of treatment are actually parents or legal guardians are able to do something called parent initiated treatment, or PIT. There is an application online. You can just Google King County parent initiated treatment, and you can fill out the paperwork for that, or you're a parent or a legal guardian, you can take your kid to Children's and say, hey, here are the criteria that I think my kiddo needs to get stabilized, and Children's does those assessments separately. There is no ITA process for juveniles.
okay, and then one more question before Adrian. Do you have a phone number for DCRs, or how do
I
we actually
do.
call them?
Hot dog, I do, and I will give it to you. And remember, like I said, you will get an answering service, and they will
Okay.
only ask you for your first and last name and phone number,
Yep.
and the person that you're referring to. You can't give them any other information. You can't say, hey, I'm at the hospital, or just tell them I'm here, or he's got a knife. Like, none of that. They will take none of that. So the DCR, Designated Crisis Responder Public Referral Line number, is 206-263-9200. 206-263-9200.
Beautiful. That's so nice. Thank you so much, because that is very unknown. Okay. Adrian, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Hi. So this was really hard for me to hear as a therapist. I like nearly started crying at the part where people can't be truly involuntarily sent to the hospital anymore if they really don't want to go.
At least on the police side, yeah,
On the
it's
flip side,
really tough.
because the DCRs don't show up for a month, so DCRs don't count for anything. So all that matters is the police. Truly, when things are imminent, what matters is the police. You know, as a therapist, everyone knows that if it's imminent, you call a police welfare check. You know, if it's imminent, you call 911, you call the police, because the DCRs won't be there for a week to a month. Well,
Mhm.
I always heard a week. A month was a horror story.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
you know, the DCRs aren't worth anything because you never know where the crisis is going to be in a week or a month, but they want to kill themselves tonight. So you call the police.
Mhm.
And when you got to the part that the police can't save a life, I mean, people are going to die from this bill. And isn't could the NAMI person correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this the bill that NAMI was advocating its members to write letters to Congress for?
I don't know.
HB 1310.
That's all good intentions without ramifications.
So
I'm feeling like really misled right now. Like this is going to kill people.
So here's what I'll tell you. Here's what I'll tell you from being in so many police departments, and I've been doing co-response since late 2016. So I was doing this level of assessment and work long before a lot of the heavy social and political unrest and things came up. I got hired specifically to divert folks with mental health concerns away from jail to appropriate help. And we still do that. It really depends on your police department and depends on your leadership to figure out who and how we support. It's not a blanket like everybody's going to die, 1310 is going to, it's can't believe I'm saying this. It's not as horrible and doom and gloom as it feels like, in the sense that so many police departments and the Washington Association for Sheriffs and Police Chiefs are pushing Washington state legislation like bulldozers to have clarity in the language. So the writer of 1310 actually has finally acknowledged the terrible language that the bill was written in that didn't figure out all of the legal nuances that have now landed us where we are, which is in frustration land. So I can honestly say that I don't think 1310 was designed to be as constricting as it is. It just ended up being that because the language and the spirit of what it was wanting to be didn't get meshed very well. So there's a little teeny Pollyanna portion of me that is hoping that in the next legislative cycle, we see a change in that.
Is it going to be rewritten so that people who actually want to die won't die?
I'm hoping so. And I will tell you, at least from my standpoint, from going out to these types of calls, is that we have gotten some pretty creative ways to negotiate and de-escalate and work somebody through. Like my call this evening. I don't want to take people to jail at all, but the way that we got access to this individual was because of a warrant. But my partners and I recognize that it ain't going to help anybody taking this poor individual to jail. So once we got in the door with the warrant, we routed the person to the emergency room, and many police departments are doing a lot of that kind of de-escalation, clever, systemic kind of juggling right now to get people where they should be going.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Well, I want to say, I really hope that NAMI does as aggressive a public information and letter writing campaign about rewriting this bill as they did about passing it, because I read every publicity email about it, that I was all on board, and I signed every petition and wrote every letter to my legislators to try to pass this. And now I'm heartbroken that I helped it pass using my story and my name and my credentials to lend credence to it. And I guess I'm hearing that it took a turn that no one expected, and that's really tragic and heartbreaking because lives are going to be lost. But I really hope that NAMI advocates as strongly for it to be rewritten as they advocated for it to be repassed with as much education.
Well, and then I can tell you there are lots of people behind that. It's not just NAMI, it's police departments, it's the sheriffs, it's police chiefs, it's tons and tons of counseling agencies. They want the clarity for imminency very clearly delineated.
Yes, and I think David wants to add something on this conversation.
I have about 1,000 questions, but the one that I'm curious about is the True Blood settlement. Does that mean that forensic cases actually get better responses than civil cases?
I don't know that I can speak to that with any degree of expertise without doing a little bit of research. The True Blood settlement has ramifications for training, is where my experience is landing more with True Blood and the underserved counties in Washington. So that I can't give you a definitive answer for without doing some digging.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think this has been a great conversation. We want to make sure that we end on time at 8 o'clock tonight. But I know there's lots of questions, but I think this has been very helpful in a lot of ways. We have a lot to learn as far as education, and also, knowing like the purpose of the bill was very important, but also getting the clarification on these nuances of it is another very important issue, which is being worked on. And we're doing our work on that as well. And I want to thank Susie so much because she's in there, she's doing the work with the individuals and doing the best she can. And Susie, is there a way we could get this infographic to share with everybody tonight?
Let's talk tomorrow, Barbie, about it.
Okay.
I think that there are pieces of it that I'm happy to figure out what we can do with it. Did
Okay.
I just send this wrong? Okay, sorry, I was looking at the chat at the same time. If
Okay.
anybody here has questions, or if they have a family member or a consult or a question that they weren't comfortable doing in this big giant forum, I put my contact information in the chat. So that you can email or call. That's my duty cell and my work email. I'm happy to triage through some calls if you're kind of seeing a direction, because I know the easy question is, where do we go from here? Who do we refer to? But my referrals for services are very situationally specific. So I wouldn't be telling somebody in Bothell the same thing I would be telling somebody in Kent. So if you do have some of those, then please feel free to reach out. You're never bothering me. I'm happy to see what I can do there.
Yeah, and thank you, Susie. That's a service that we don't expect. But
It's my
definitely
job.
having connection to you has been one of the best parts of my life. So I call you all the time. So
Shoot me
thank you
emails.
so
I'm happy
much.
to field as many as I can. And if I can't find the answer myself, I will find you somebody smarter.
Okay, beautiful. Well, thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. Thank you again to our sponsor, Evergreen Health, for doing this forum tonight. I think it's a very important conversation, as uncomfortable as it can be. It is something that we do need to talk about. We need to know the reality of a situation, which this is the reality, and we would like to make it better. And that's where we come in. And if you have something to say about it, well, your voice can be heard, and we are all listening. We're trying to make it better. We're trying to help everybody. I think everybody on this call tonight has the perfect intention of doing the best we can with what we have to work with.
And
But-
if anybody has any, like I said, additional questions, I teach at the Police Academy. I do the crisis intervention, the behavioral health trainings. I give officers all of the behavioral health signs and symptoms and de-escalation techniques. I teach with a cadre of folks that are very committed to this level of training. So if you have questions about officers training, if you have questions about de-escalation, if you have questions about cities and co-responding mental health professionals, which cities have them, which cities don't have them, if you're looking for how or what other alternative responses there are to somebody in crisis, especially with 988 having some legislative difficulties here last November or this November, I'm happy to field through a lot of that and get you in touch with the folks that are doing that frontline work to have a myriad of types of responses to crisis, whether it's police, counselor, police, fire, counselor, fire. King County is pretty deep into those layers of triaged responses. So if you have questions about who might be coming to your door and what other opportunities or options are available, I'm happy to point you in that direction.
Thank you, Susie Kroll. Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. I look forward to having you at our next one in December. Thank you.